Thank you for joining. This is the third webinar we've done on this topic. It's very timely, very popular. So the purpose is to talk about the recent US legislative changes. I will start out by giving just a little synopsis of what we know and what's happened. And then we will engage in a discussion and explanation of primarily Grenada, but also a little bit about Turkey, about how you might still be able to use those programs to avail oneself of the E2 visa. So with that said, let's get started. Can we move to the next slide, please, Duncan? So a little bit about our firm, and then I'll ask Margaret to talk about herself, giving her a moment to unmute. My law firm, as people know, we have offices all over the world. We're commonly ranked as a top 25 law firm for immigration. We have done many E2 cases, and many of them involving persons who have obtained Grenadian citizenship. And so far, all of those have been successful with no problems at all. We also, as part of the Grenada process, to do Grenada, you are required to have a local lawyer, of which Margaret is one of the preeminent lawyers in Grenada. And also you're required to have an international license, which I believe my law firm is the only law firm in the United States to have. Duncan, next slide. This is just some media coverage my firm has had. Duncan, next slide, please. This is where we are in the world, and most importantly, we have a presence in, obviously, in the United States. Margaret is here from Grenada, and we also have a relationship with a firm that does many cases, citizenship by investment cases in Turkey. Next slide, please, Margaret. Please, Duncan. Right. What is the E2 investor visa? Probably most people know this. If you have any questions, please do ask them. I'm happy to answer them. But generally, there's two kinds of E2 visas. The main kind of E2 visa is available for the national of an E2 country, and it enables them to direct and control a commercial business in the United States. The other type of E2 visa then allows that business to bring workers of the same nationality to the United States. Although a lot of people are not familiar with it, that's actually one of the most popular types of E2 visas because of the Japanese market. We've seen, especially in India and Vietnam, we've seen the rise, I would say, of especially Grenada and E2 recently, and some of that's got to do with challenges with the EB-5 program. So who is this used by? Nationals of countries who are E2, who have an E2 treaty. If you don't have an E2 treaty, and there's a list of these countries here that you can see, countries that do not have an E2 treaty, then one of the common thing that started to happen, as I just mentioned, and it's gained more and more popularity recently, is people obtain citizenship in another country in order to get the E2 visa. Next slide, please, Duncan. So let's see what's recently happened. The US legislation has changed. There was an act in the Congress back in about June, which was introduced, called the Amigos Act. The Amigos Act mainly is targeted, as it says, at Portugal and making E2 Portugal an E2 and E1 country. It also, however, contained terms that say that if you obtained an E2 visa through a financial investment, you must be domiciled in that country for 3 years. An interesting change we'll talk about with Margaret was when this law was first promoted, the word was not domicile, it was reside. So they have changed the word reside to domicile. And, domicile is a term of art, and we'll talk a little bit about what some of the consequences of domicile versus residency are. This act then has recently passed the US Senate. It passed the US Senate as part of the Defense Authorization Act, and then it was signed into law by President Biden in late December. What right now we don't know, and we're trying to find out, is an implementation date for this new law. So whilst it's passed by the president, we still are not certain of the implementation date. We will talk in a minute about the attitude of the US State Department to this and changes that are likely to happen. Next slide, please, Duncan. I will answer the question in a second. Do we have the slide with the comparison of the programs, Duncan? No. So there are 3 programs that primarily have been used to do this recently. One is Montenegro. The reason Montenegro is dead because that program came to an end at the end of December. So Montenegro's still not a viable option. In addition to Montenegro, Grenada and Turkey are 2 countries that have allowed citizenship by investment. So without further ado, we can start talking about Grenada. Margaret, can you introduce yourself? Okay, there's the slide I was looking for. Thank you, Duncan. We seem to have audio problem with Margaret.
I'm here now.
I beg your pardon?
I'm here now.
Oh, sorry, Margaret. Can you introduce yourself?
Good day, all. I'm Margaret Wilkinson from Grenada and a resident in Grenada. I am the senior partner at the law firm of Wilkinson, Wilkinson & Wilkinson, which is a full-service law firm. I'm also the managing director of the immigration company Infinity Grenada, Inc. And we are licensed local agents, which means we work with all marketing agents and individuals processing within the Grenada Citizenship by Investment Program. And for persons who wish to have a detail on the Grenada Citizenship by Investment Program, the program came into effect in 2013 by law, and we have processed several applications since then. What are the benefits of the Grenada program? Mark, you wish me to go on to that at this point?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. So the benefits of the Grenada program, which is not full or I can state all, there's so many. The benefits include the retention of your original citizenship. We do not ask you to relinquish your original citizenship. We are part of the Commonwealth of Nations. We also, well, Mark has mentioned, we have the E2 visa. We don't require any physical residence. We issue our passports within 3 to 5 days once an applicant is approved. We also have no language test, no interview. We are not concerned much about your history and culture, although we'll appreciate when you become a citizen to integrate it into ours. And we have 3 main investment options, which is the National Transformation Fund, the Approved Project, and the Significant Investor. The National Transformation Fund has 2 routes, which is $150 for a single applicant, $150,000 US for a single applicant, or $200,000 for a family of 4. The Approved Project route, they have 2 options as well, and that is $220,000 per share in a unit, or $350,000 for an investment in an approved project. The significant investor route, that is an investment of 5 million into some major project, manufacturing or otherwise, into Grenada. And by virtue of that, citizenship is granted to the major investor and their families. So having said that, I then speak a little bit about Infinity Grenada Inc., our company. And our company process applications. We not only process applications, we also have a program which we call making a passport holder a citizen. So we also join in ensuring that persons get their driver's license, tax ID, passports, tax ID. We do renewals, bank accounts. So
Margaret, let's talk about like the topic in hand. I understand with Grenada, right, lots of people did the partial investment route of 220,000. As I see it, that's clearly a financial investment. And that's going to slap on a 3-year domicile requirement now in the United States. We can, maybe there's a tiny window with an implementation date on this law, but essentially the ability to do that is probably gone. So let's talk about other ways to get Grenadian citizenship. So you were talking about the fund. That is a system whereby I essentially give money to the government and people of Grenada. To me, an investment means that I make I invest my money in something with the hope of a return and getting my money back. If I go to a shop, right, and I buy a bag of oranges and I give the shopkeeper money for a bag of oranges, I don't really call giving it an investment. I call it a purchase, right? I've purchased a bag of oranges. So Margaret, can you explain in Grenada, like what the attitude of the Grenadian government is to changes and things, and whether they see this as an investment where people are going to get their money back, or whether donation is a simple one transaction, which is more of a gift?
Well, under the Grenada Citizenship by Investment Act, the National Transformation Fund says it means a special fund established under the Public Finance Management Act for the purpose of funding government-sponsored projects, including private partnerships. So that having been said, the person is going to get no return on what they paid to the government of Grenada. And so the question you asked, and the question we have been discussing before, is can that be considered an investment? And you and I have both concluded no. It is a payment. It is a payment for the development into a country. In return, you get a passport.
We're also talking about Turkey here. Unfortunately, Barlas couldn't join us. Barlas is the managing member of our Turkish team. Turkey does not have a donation option in their program. Doesn't exist, right? So we can talk about their bank deposit route, which no one's heard of and maybe will be a bit more famous now, but they don't have it. So Grenada does have this donation option, which seems to me to be an example. If I do donation, just so people know, how long, just remind us of the process for donation.
Mark?
Yes, just remind us for the process for a donation case, Margaret, and how long it takes.
Oh, the process for a donation, after we compile all of the documentation as prescribed by our legislation, it is submitted to the Citizenship by Investment Unit, and they do the necessary due diligence on the applicants. And I can tell you that the due diligence process is quite stringent. So once you get approved by Grenada, you know that you have gone through certain due diligence, and then the application is processed within 90 days. Sometimes we have delays, but that is due to that of a due diligence provider may request additional documents, may request clarification. But I think an interesting point to remember, Margaret, is, and I'll ask,
when you start this process, do you have to, the sort of the day you start, do you have to put down the entire 150,000 on day one? Or is it sort of a staggered process before you get
No,
an
you put down submission fees, which is roughly 8,000 per applicant. If you're under 17, the fees are less.
Okay. And so I don't
So
have to pay, when do I have to pay my $150,000?
when you are approved as an applicant, that's when you pay 150,000. And that's also after you get your citizenship certificate, that is when you apply for your passport and pay the necessary
Got it.
passport fees at that point.
So how long does it take me to get to the point where I've invested my $150,000?
So if all goes smoothly, it would be 90 days, plus our passports are issued in 3 to 5 days. And we have an expedited route in which the passports are issued within 24 hours for an additional payment.
Okay, gotcha. So we have a question, Margaret, and the question is, donation option in Grenada. Do we require proof of residential address in the country? So, I will add some context to this and then let Margaret answer. So we have done many of these cases, and what we have found, for example, I have spoken directly to the chief consul officer in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, about this, and was told directly in a public forum that as far as the consulate there are concerned, the US law as it stands requires no connections to Grenada, and they don't care whether you ever set foot in Grenada or not. Now, Margaret, I think you've worked with Barbados. Barbados is relevant because if you do Grenada, Barbados is where the US consulate that covers Grenada. So the two places, one of the places two main places we see these cases are in the home country of the applicant. And the example I just gave you was Vietnam, and then also in Barbados. So Margaret, what have you seen with Barbados?
Barbados asks you for the residence. Barbados do ask a lot of questions in relation to your residence and your connectivity to the country.
So if I do the straight donation, my experience, we've had clients go to Barbados is we've gotten them all none of them have actually lived in Grenada, but what we've done is we've obtained them, I think every single one, a Grenadian tax ID. Certainly not necessary in Vietnam, but in Barbados cases, that's something we've done. How long does it take to get a Grenadian tax ID, Margaret?
3 days.
3 days. So not a difficult thing to do. So I think that's answered the question. So, that gives me an idea of the overall time frame. And then Margaret's explained, I get the Grenadian passport. So another facet of Grenadian law is, Margaret, I think, and in Turkey too, we were hearing from Balas, is if you are a citizen of Grenada, right, and you have a spouse, can your spouse obtain Grenadian citizenship? No financial investment needed. So my question is, if I'm married, let's say, Margaret, we were married, right now, I'm not a citizen of Grenada, and I wanted to be a citizen of Grenada, nothing to do with any kind of financial investment. Can I do that?
Yes, by virtue of the Constitution of Grenada, it is stated that if you are married to a citizen of Grenada, you are entitled to citizenship. There is a process you go through, and that application is generally processed through the Office of the Prime Minister. But the processing and where that application is submitted may change from time to time. So where the application is submitted is that is not relevant, but the fact remains the spouse of the Grenadian citizen is entitled to citizenship.
Right. So let's suppose that, a year ago, you got Grenadian citizenship, let's say, through the partial investment route. But at that time, as your spouse, I didn't get it, or perhaps we got married later. So then I can still get my Grenadian citizenship, got nothing to do with financial investment, on the basis of marriage to a spouse, right?
Yes, you can
Right.
still get your citizenship on that basis.
So I had a very formal I need to emphasize, very informal conversation with someone with the US State Department. And it is not the official position of the US State Department. It's an informal conversation with somebody. But, you know, their opinion was that this change in the law does not touch marriage to a Grenadian spouse. So in other words, if my spouse went through the financial investment route, and then I got citizenship by marriage, I would be clear to go ahead and apply for an E2. Now, that is not, just to emphasize, so I'm not misquoted, that is not the official position of the US State Department. We don't know what the official position of the US State Department is at that time, at this time. That is like an informal, very informal conversation with somebody there. But it's going to be a very difficult time, I think, for a consular officer to see a case based on marriage and claim that that's a financial investment, because it clearly isn't. And that's clearly not what the US legislation says. We have a meeting scheduled with the consular staff, happens to be in Vietnam in February, and we'll discuss this with them then. It's probably too early for them to have an idea. And then, you know, we will need to approach other consulates as well. But the initial indication is that they will not deem marriage to a citizen to be a financial, they can't, if you think about it, it's irrational. I will answer for Turkey. In the case of Turkey, the spouse can also obtain immediate citizenship of a Turkish national as well. So in this regard, Turkey and Grenada are similar. However, remember, Turkey does not have the donation option. And, you know, again, on a basis of similar indication, the indication is it's going to be very difficult for the US State Department to characterize a donation as a financial investment. Margaret, do you have any other comments about this sort of spousal route from a Grenada perspective?
Well, Mark,
Yes, ma'am.
in relation to the question of whether you can question if the spouse who gets married at a later stage or was married, how the council in Barbados may view their citizenship. The reality is that the right of that spouse is enshrined in our constitution. And it is not like other islands where if you get, like for instance, in some of the other islands, if you get citizenship, you do not have the same rights as the persons born there. But in Grenada, because of how our constitution is structured, when we got independence from England in 1974, our constitution gives that right to every single person who is a Grenadian, who is a citizen of Grenada, to not just register, not just have their spouse get citizenship through them, but also their children. So the citizen who comes through the Grenada citizenship by investment route has the ability to live and work in Grenada as though they were born in Grenada. And they also have that opportunity to pass it on to their spouse and to their children. So it will be difficult, I think, to question that person exercising a constitutional right.
Does the spouse have to have any residence in Grenada? So let's suppose
No.
I live in, I just see an Indian person here. So let's just suppose I live in Mumbai. Let's suppose I've never set foot in Mumbai ever, and I get my Grenadian passport, let's just say through investment for the argument's sake. Even though I've never been to Grenada, can I pass on a Grenadian citizenship to my wife who's also never been to Grenada?
Yes, you can, because the requirement is marriage. The requirement is not residence.
Okay, and then the same, I can tell you that it's the same answer for Turkey as well.
That is correct.
Now, Margaret, we've talked about spouses. What about children? So let's suppose that I have gotten my Grenadian citizenship, let's just say by investment for the second, not donation. Now I have, let's say I have two children. One is 17 and one is 23. and they didn't obtain it at the same time, what are their rights with relation to a Grenadian passport?
They are entitled to the Grenadian passport. No, not the passport. They are entitled to citizenship.
Okay.
Up to the age of 18.
Up to the age
Up
of
to the
18.
age of 18, yes.
So
They
the
must
one who's
apply
the one who's
before 18.
23 can't do it, but the one who's 17 can.
Yes. But also, Mark, I wanted to stress this point in relation to the Grenada Constitution, because we not only take into account the fact that you are married, but we also take into the account the fact that even if you got a divorce from a Grenadian citizen, you are still entitled to citizenship.
Oh,
Even if your spouse died, the fact is you are still entitled to Grenadian citizenship.
That's fascinating, Margaret.
Because our constitution says any person who is married to a citizen of Grenada, or who has been married to a person who was, during the subsistence of the marriage, a citizen of Grenada, shall be entitled to the citizenship.
Wow, that is really great, Margaret. Thank you.
Yes, and so we welcome all the citizens.
Just add a note for Turkey here. Turkey allows, if you are the child of a Turkish national, and Margaret and I learned from Barlas the other day that there is no age restriction. So in other words, you know, if I wanted to get a citizenship by investment, I could do, say, the bank deposit route in Turkey. Or let's say my son wanted to do it, and my son's 35. I could do a Turkish citizenship by bank deposit. When I become a Turkish national, even though my son is 35, I can give him a Turkish passport, and then he would arguably be probably be E2 eligible, because he has received his Turkish nationality as a result of being the son of a Turkish citizen. Again, nothing to do with financial investment. So Turkey and Grenada both offer the passport generously to a spouse, and then they also offer it to children. It seems to me that, you know, if I haven't already made a financial investment and I wanted to do this, it would seem to me that using the donation route, where, you know, that, as I said, the attitude of the US State Department is not crystal clear right now, will be soon. But, you know, Margaret has told us that, you know, the government of, well, I'll let Margaret speak again about the attitude of the government of Grenada to helping with perhaps some cosmetic changes with the definition of donation and investment. But, you know, if I got a residency, a Grenadian citizenship through investment, through donation, then most likely that's not investment. And so then leaving my spouse out of it, it also would then allow my spouse and potentially children under 18, in the case of Grenada, to then become Grenadian citizens through the family relationship. Again, nothing to do with a financial investment, and arguably donations, nothing to do with a financial investment either. So it creates sort of a double argument, double safety. So Margaret, as I mentioned, I think you kindly explained to me like some things that why E2 is important to the government of Grenada, and why they might be doing some things potentially with the definition of donation to make it clear that it's not a financial investment.
I would say that the whole citizenship of investment program is important to Grenada. And as of 23rd of June, 2023, we saw the change of government, and the current Prime Minister has indicated that the citizenship by investment program is very valuable to Grenada. The income from it we need, and further that there are changes coming. I can actually say that within a short time, we will see that we're going to consolidate our act and make some changes, and maybe based on what is evolving here, we would take that into consideration. But prior to all of this happening, we were doing a consolidation of our legislation. So to, I will say that the government is on the ball with this, Mark.
Great. Margaret, a question. I know you just answered this, but perhaps we just need to repeat it. It says, hi, Margaret, please speak to the processing time for Grenada citizenship by marriage.
Oh, it is somewhere between 6 months and 9 months. And I will indicate that I processed an application as recent as December, and it took 6 months. So It is somewhere within that time frame. And given that we are all still recovering from COVID and things are still not perfect, the time frame, I would anticipate that that time frame will be reduced.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Here is a question. I read on one of the first slides that the Grenadian citizenships is not applicable for the E2 treaty investor visa. Indian citizens are not applicable. That's true. India is not a E2 visa country. Is this correct? Yes, it's correct. Does this mean that an Indian citizen cannot apply for Grenadian visa through investment? Well, first of all, it's not a Grenadian visa, right? A visa just gets you the right to visit a country. But if you are an Indian citizen, you cannot get an E2. That's got nothing to do with your ability to get a Grenadian visa or Grenadian citizenship. If you're an Indian citizen, one of the things that a number of our clients have done, who are Indian citizens, is that they get themselves a Grenadian passport. And we're talking right now about ways to obtain a Grenadian passport. One is by financial investment, which now seems to be problematic if you want to get an E2 visa. Another is donation, that's giving money to the government of Grenada. And the third is through a spouse. And as you know, we mentioned, it used to be that when people did donation, sometimes they gifted $200,000 instead of 150. And the reason you do that is because that gets you and your entire family Grenadian passports. That, I suspect, will not be so popular anymore, because if you get donation 150,000 for yourself and then bring your spouse along, your spouse is then getting citizenship through marriage, and that seems to be clearly outside the reach of this new US law, though the official position of the US State Department is still unknown. And why do we care about the position of the US State Department? That's because the E2 visa is unique. With most visas, step one is that they are adjudicated by USCIS in the United States. With an E2 visa, your case will be adjudicated in a consulate and reviewed by the consular officer. So we want to take a look at the position of the US State Department. You can do change of status within the United States. That's a little bit of a complicated topic, and we'll talk about that in a second, especially in the case of Indians. But it can be done, and then your case would actually be adjudicated by USCIS. So that's a different government department. So Margaret, let's talk about domicile. Let's suppose I got my citizenship by investment 3 years ago, and so now a 3-year period is up. In your mind, Margaret, what does it mean to be domiciled in Grenada under Grenadian law? Margaret? Well, we seem to have lost.
Yes, I'm here.
What?
Grenada has no law that speaks to domicile. So we are governed by the common law as relates to domicile. As you are aware, there are some countries which state to deem that you are domiciled in that country, you have to live there for 180 days, or they give a figure. We do not have that. So we fall under the common law definition of domicile, which is basically you must show a connectivity to the country. And in that case, there are many ways that we can show a connectivity to, you can show a connectivity to Grenada. And there's a process which once we are requested to address it, it can be addressed. So there's a process which you would use to determine your domicile under the common law.
Okay, thank you. So I can tell you, so why is that relevant? It's relevant because if you look at other cases and if you look at other laws, the US has typically looked to foreign law to a question of what does it mean to be domiciled in that country, right? So in the case of Grenada, Margaret, if I had filed Grenadian tax returns for 3 years, I had a Grenadian tax ID, but I'd never been in the island, how would you, what else would you want to do with me as your client in order to declare that or write an opinion letter that I've been domiciled in Grenada?
Where, if you have never been to the island, you have never been to the island, you have never paid taxes, you have never done anything in relation to the island? Is that what you are saying?
Yeah, well,
You
maybe I
just
filed
simply
Grenadian tax returns. I filed tax returns.
Well, tax returns is one of the ways that can be used for determining that you are domiciled in a country under the common law. So, but I will still suggest that you should do a little bit more than just file tax returns. You should at least have something that brought you to the island.
What would you suggest?
Which would include a bank account.
Okay.
An address. There must be more than just having a tax return.
Tax return. But if I haven't, but what's the requirement for physical residency?
We have absolutely no requirement for physical residency.
Okay, so for example, I think it was the first ever India-Grenada case we did, because it was donation involving Barbados, we got the client a very cheap lease, so that when they turned up at the US consulate, they had a Grenada address and they leased the property at a very inexpensive rate in Grenada. So now let's suppose, in addition to having filed Grenadian tax returns, I also have a little property, at least an address. Although I've never been there, I have a residential address in Grenada. Does that help? Does that get me there? Does that get me your opinion letter, Margaret?
Well, it depends on what would be the Barbados concept of connecting the you never having visited the country that you came, you are domiciled. So from where I sit, you should at least have visited the country.
Okay. So now I want to visit it as well. I'm not trying to get a precise formula from you, Margaret. I'm just trying to get the idea that I don't have to, in order to be legally domiciled in Grenada, from a Grenadian perspective, I don't have to live there. I think you're saying you would want to have visited Grenada, but that's not the same as living there.
But I must clarify that under the Grenada Citizenship by Investment Program, no form of residency or a visit to the country is required to entitle you to get citizenship. So what we speak of as establishing domicile is simply for the purpose of the E2 visa.
Right.
Because I don't want us to lose that point, because Grenada has no restrictions in that way on a person who applies for citizenship. We don't ask that person to visit Grenada, neither do we ask them to be resident in Grenada for any period of time for them to be entitled to the citizenship. So when we speak to the domicile and we speak to them having at least visited Grenada and have an address, that is simply for the purpose of the E2 visa process.
Okay, understood. Margaret, so it seems to me as though I could potentially, US consulates tend to care about opinion letters. I could potentially turn up at the US consulate anywhere in the world with an opinion letter from you that I'm domiciled in Grenada. And when I have some connections to Grenada, genuine connections, that from a Grenadian perspective, I'm domiciled in that country when I really have not lived there for 180 days a year. And in fact, I've perhaps only visited there maybe sort of once or twice or something. Is that true or not true?
I would say yes, because we are common law in terms of domicile. And once we can establish that connectivity and intent, you can get that opinion letter to establish that you are domiciled.
So not that hard. Now, because we were also talking about Turkey, I'll speak for Balas, who couldn't make it. In terms of Turkey, there's no way you can do that. You know, Barlas was on with Margaret and I yesterday, and we were talking, and you know, Barlas explained that in Turkey, there's no way around it. You need to, for to be domiciled in Turkey, you have to be there 180 days a year. So this new law, this concept of 3 years of domicile, comparing the two popular options left, which are Turkey and Grenada, there are some relative advantages and disadvantages. If you're someone who's done a financial investment, it pretty much seems to me, you know, you're dead in the water with Turkey, unless you can perhaps squeeze through before this law is implemented. Because if you're going to claim that you've been domiciled there, you've actually got to live in Turkey, for, according to Barlas, for 180 days a year. And then Margaret has explained that's not the case with Grenada. It might be somewhat easier. Is that fair, Margaret? I don't want to mischaracterize you. I'm just being careful.
That is correct.
Okay, that's fine. So we have a lot of questions, Margaret. Who decides the accepted definition of domicile, Grenada or the United States? Well, that is a very good question. If you look at the way that the United States has treated other legislation, and in other legislation for other purposes, right? The definition of domicile is with the country claiming domicile. And there's some international treaties that the United States is the signature to, that it would make it very, very difficult for the United States suddenly to start saying, no, we decide what domicile means to be domiciled in a particular country. So, you know, we have to see what happens with this. And as I explained, we do not know what the attitude of the US State Department to the definition of domicile or this, you know, whether the definition of the donation option. However, as I said, I did have an informal conversation with someone who works for the State Department, and it is not the official position of the US State Department, which we haven't heard yet, but the initial reaction was, there's no way on earth that we can claim the spousal route is a financial investment, and so it should be clear. And that the donation option, you know, the feeling was it would be okay. I don't want to speak for the US State Department because I can't, and I don't know what their position is. But, you know, donation, as you talk to people who are, you know, in the industry, it seems to be clear. And, you know, I'll talk about perhaps the reason why in a second. And then this question of domicile, it would be a change of policy of if the US suddenly started to tell Grenada what it means to be domiciled in Grenada. That seems to be, you know, the sort of the case. So, no, domicile is not a term of, if you look, it's not a capitalized term in the new rules. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, it started life as the word, as a different word. It started life as a residency word, which is a word that suggests more physical presence. And then it changed. And by the time this act reached the Senate, it changed to domicile. One of the things was there was a potential change going to happen between the Amigos Act, which is the House version of this legislation, and the Senate version. And the potential change being talked about was to have it that it wasn't 3 years domicile or residency, but 3 years with a substantial connection to the country. So obviously, substantial connection doesn't necessarily mean any physical presence at all. And there are a number of countries that have the concept of substantial connection. They actually have that in the UK. And we've got like a whole body of law of what that means in the UK. And it doesn't necessarily mean to be present in the island. So whilst the US did not go for a substantial connection in this law, they did change the law to the word domicile. And around the world, in different countries, the word domicile is not held to imply, it's up to the country involved. So as I said, we have to see what the attitude of the US State Department is to domicile, and with USCIS, what the attitude to domicile is. But, you know, just bear in mind that was a change. That was a change when the government the politicians were considering moving in the direction of substantial investment. So I think that's the way I have to answer that question for right now. what if developers return the investment funds? Is it still an investment? Well, that's an interesting question. So to me, you would still have gotten your passport through investment. But Margaret, if someone was to return the investment funds, surely they wouldn't be too soon. Surely they wouldn't be entitled to a Grenadian passport.
Well, if is that question in relation to someone who has already completed the process, or who
I'm
is
not sure. Margaret,
well,
the
if you have put in all the investment funds, then you would have completed the process. Yes. So thinking this through, you would have completed the process. But the agreements with the investors speak to the terms as with the developers, speak to the term as to how you get a return on your investment. So I don't know that there'd be any developer that would be jumping to return the investment sum if it was not part of the original investment agreement. And why would they want to do that?
Right. I think, what it is once you do your Grenada investment, you're required to maintain that investment for a number of years, right?
A minimum of 3 years.
Right. So if I, if I went,
but even so, Mark, to return the investment, it must have been part of the initial agreement between the developer and the investor.
I see what you mean.
It wouldn't just come out because there's a change in what may be the E2 position.
Yeah, I don't think returning the investment suddenly magically makes it not an investment.
No. Maybe I'm not understanding the question.
Right.
Maybe I should seek clarity on the question.
Here is a question
as it stands, every developer, every investor signs a contract with the developer. And you get your investment if you get approved as a citizen of Grenada. And but your contract is what will determine how your investment operates.
Gotcha. So here is a question from one of our dear clients, which is, hello, Mark. What are the chances of getting an E2 visa from a US consulate after attaining Grenadian citizenship? Well, first thing is, I think it depends how you got the citizenship and the timing. So right now, we don't have an implementation date for this new law. So if I go to a US consulate today, having got however I've gotten my Grenadian citizenship, seems to me this new part of the law is not in play yet. And so we don't know. We're trying to find out what the timeline on that is, and I don't know right now. But that's a very tiny window, and that's not sort of the main show here. So if I get my my Grenadian citizenship through marriage to a Grenadian, which is, we've explained the route, that's got nothing to do with investment. That clearly is, to me, that is clearly beyond the reach of this new act. So, worst case scenario, if my spouse has their Grenadian citizenship, say through donation, and doesn't want the process, and I didn't get mine through the donation, I can now obtain one as a spouse. It would seem to me that it would be very difficult for a US consulate to say that's inappropriate. And I would likely get my E2 visa. Now we talk about donation. If you've gone through the donation route, Margaret and I are saying that there's no way that a donation is a financial investment, which is what the US law talks about. So I should get my E2 visa. But as I have said, we do not know what the attitude of the US State Department on this is going to be right now. To me, as I said, the initial indication is that they feel that there's no way that can be called a financial investment, simply because it isn't a financial investment of any kind. If you're going through the partial investment route, that's clearly a financial investment, and you would be subject to the domicile. So your chances of getting the E2 visa, obviously, if you've been domiciled in Grenada for 3 years, then there's no question about anything. You can get it straight away. But if you haven't done that, I think it's going to depend on how you got it. You know, with Turkey, they do have the spousal option. And with Turkey, you know, one of the things I was mentioning earlier, which I think is absolutely fantastic, is children can get their citizenship of any age. And I mentioned that earlier. So, you know, we're looking at getting a passport through family relationships. I think that's a very different thing. I think that's answered that question, Deepak. If you want more clarity around that, please ask, and you know, we're happy to go over it. Let's see that. So let's read this one. I have a question with respect to citizenship of my parent. My mother is a senior, aged 75 years. Would she be able to be part of my family if there is no spouse and children? If not, are there other ways to obtain citizenship other than a separate donation? So Margaret, let's apply that to Grenada. Did you get the question, or do you want me to reread it?
Well, who would be the applicant in that question? Because under the Grenada program, we accept parents, grandparents, and siblings of the main applicant or the main applicant's spouse. So the wording on the question, I don't understand, but once there's an applicant, the parents of that applicant, the grandparents of that applicant, the children of that applicant, or children up to the age of 30, or a sibling of that applicant who is not wed and don't have children can join in that application.
Margaret, I think the question is, if I'm an applicant and I have a mother who's 75,
she can be joined.
Can she be joined?
Yes.
Right, now note that, you know, what we're talking about, if you want an E2 visa, you might not want your mother to be joined. You might want to separate her. There's no age restriction on but hold on, sorry, I'm talking, it's only spouses and children. So no, the mother could be joined to your original application, right, Margaret?
Yes.
Yeah. So, or she could do a separate application of her own, as this questioner mentions. So done. What happens in cases where developers return investment funds to applicants? It's the same question again, really, Margaret, isn't it?
It is.
We answered it, and the answer is that's still an investment, and great, you got your money back. And depending how soon they return it, you might lose your Grenadian passport. If they return it too quickly, within, I think Margaret said 3 years. Was it 3 years, Margaret?
3 years.
Yeah, if they return it within 3 years, you may lose your Grenadian passport. But if they return it after 3 years, great, you got your money back. But it was still through investment. And so your only route is going to be to work with a very clever lawyer like Margaret to establish yourself that you've been domiciled in Grenada. And then you may have a way forwards. But you're going to have to rely on domicile unless perhaps you have a spouse or children that you can then call as Grenadian citizens through the family route. So this question. Lots of questions, Margaret. Hi, myself experienced chemical engineer from Pakistan. Would it be possible for you to evaluate my profile and come with some well, we can come up with some immigration options. I assume you mean to the United States. Also, we have a company provide consultation to professionals. So the person who's asking from Pakistan, please contact us separately, because that's you're not giving details of your personal circumstances, and that is a very personalized question. Did I understand that if you marry and divorce a Grenadian, Margaret, you can apply for citizenship even after a divorce if you didn't apply during the marriage?
Yes, you can.
But I didn't know. I learn something every time I talk to Margaret, and this is something I learned today, which is very helpful to some people.
Grenadians, we like all persons. Not because the marriage didn't work out, we don't want you. We don't treat persons like that.
Right. Okay. Just a comment, you know, when you're talking about all persons, Margaret, and does Grenada recognize same-sex marriages? for this purpose?
By virtue of our constitution speaks to a marriage between a male and a female. So at this point in time, to enable same-sex marriage, we need to change our constitution wording. We have gone to referendum on 2 occasions to change things within our constitution, but the Grenada public has not accepted the referendum. And so the constitution we got in 1973, coming out of independence in 74, that is what stands. So to give a direct answer, the answer is no.
Okay, thanks.
But it is just that it is enshrined in a place where it is difficult, but it is not something that has not come on it has come on many times for discussion, but it's simply a situation where, because it has to go to the whole population, a large percentage of the population to vote in the referendum, the changes to the constitution have not occurred.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, Margaret. Here's another question. And I think this perhaps clarifies that we were being asked about returning money. I think Aura Caribbean returns 100% of the fees at the end of the 5 years. So Aura Caribbean is a project that was, the way the project is structured is they said they would return the fees. Now, they may or may not have the money to do that. And when I say that, I'm not saying anything bad about Aura Caribbean at all. You know, they probably will return the money, but I'm just pointing out that any investment anywhere in the world, in order to return the money, they've actually got to have it. But Aura Caribbean was someone who was doing that. And I don't think that really has any bearing on anything we're talking about. The investment is still through a financial investment. So it doesn't disqualify you for E2, but it imposes the 3-year domicile that we're talking about. Any comments on that, Margaret?
Well, Aura Caribbean, and as I indicated before, it is based on the contract between the developer and the applicant. And Aura Caribbean, their contracts are very clear in that they will give a return of a percentage of monies, or 100% of the monies, after a particular period. So it is a contract between the developer and the parties. And this is what I said initially, that for the return of an investment, it has to be what did you sign up for and what did you sign on to. And to qualify it, I think Aura Caribbean will have the ability to return the monies, Mark.
Right. Yeah, I wasn't questioning that, Margaret. I was just making, sometimes we see, especially with EB5, is clients assume that it's absolutely guaranteed they'll get the money back and that they can sue someone if they don't get the money back. Well, they can sue someone if they don't get the money back, but in order to get the money back, they got to have the money, right? And so it's nothing to do with Aura. It's just as a general concept. I've seen so many EB5 people who say, well, I'm entitled to get my money back, so I want to sue. And it's like, okay, go ahead and sue. But it won't do you any good if they don't actually have the money. So I'm just making a general point, nothing specific about Aura Caribbean at all. Okay, it could be me or my mother, depending on whoever would be recommended to apply for it. Okay, all right, that sounds very specific. Is it 3 or 5? Okay, so a point of clarification, Margaret. Is it 3 or 5 years for the investment to be held? Please clarify. I assume they mean under the Grenadian investment program. Margaret?
Just give me one moment.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So carry on and I'll come back to that point.
Right, I wanted to, I use this opportunity just to mention Turkish bank deposit route, because most people have never heard of this. And the reason most people have never heard of the Turkish bank deposit option, honestly, is because agents don't get paid any commission. So greedy agents who want money get paid nothing if you do Turkish bank deposit. What Turkish bank deposit option is this, is if you open a bank account in Turkey and you deposit, it's $500,000 US, it's your bank account, you can take the money back whenever you want to. So you could take it back the very next day. You're in full control of it, and it can be denominated in US dollars. However, the day that you invest, you can begin the process to get a Turkish passport, which take a couple of months, and you will have a Turkish citizenship through having that bank deposit. It's called through capital transfer. As long as you keep the money in that account for 3 years, you get to keep your Turkish passport forever. Now, whether or not bank deposit will be deemed to be a financial investment, we don't know. That seems to me a lot more questionable than a donation route. However, remember what we said earlier, that if I have a Turkish citizenship, then my child, it doesn't matter how old they are, they can get it by virtue of being my child. So I think one of the things that we might see is more people getting Turkish citizenship through opening a Turkish bank account, which really has no financial risk, because you can get your money back whenever you want to. And then having their perhaps even older children apply. So in other words, if I right now was from India or Vietnam or Russia or somewhere, I want to get a US E2 visa, what I might do is have my parent put $500,000 in a Turkish bank, let my parent get their Turkish citizenship, and then I will get Turkish citizenship by virtue of being their child, which is clearly not a financial investment. You can debate, and I suspect there will be debate about whether bank deposit is a financial investment or not. But that's, when we're looking at all of this, it's all about, some of it's about risk, right? It's about, if I go through the Grenada program, I put down $150,000 plus fees, and then I can't get the E2, problem. Well, if you go that Turkish route, yes, there are some processing fees, but really there's no risk, because you can get your $500,000 back whenever you want to. So, I suspect that we might see some more movement with that. But do remember that Turkey does not have a donation option, and is very strict on domicile. So in terms of domicile and in terms of the donation option, Grenada is really the only option left in the world for anybody to looking at this. For Indian citizens, what is the time period and investment required to get Grenadian citizenship? And then subsequently, the time period and investment to get US citizenship. Margaret, this question was literally only asked a minute ago, so I know we've been through it, but obviously people aren't clear. So can you very kindly just go over the investment required, or not the investment, the donation required, and the time period for Grenadian citizenship?
Okay, before I do that, I'll speak to the time that I may have spoken ahead of myself, in that I spoke to 3 years, but under the current act, it speaks to 5 years that you need to hold the investment for, from when you attain your citizenship.
Okay, so the 5 years.
That's the current act.
So if you get your money back within 5 years, you lose your
Yes.
Grenadian passport, is that right?
No, you never lose your Grenada passport.
So if I invest, hold on a second, if I invest today, right?
Yes.
Let's say in Aura Caribbean, just because that's what someone mentioned, right? And
Yes.
I put down my full investment, I get my Grenada passport, and the very next day after getting my Grenada passport, I get my money back. I get to keep my Grenada passport?
Yes, of course. You are a citizen of Grenada. The passport then make you a citizen. And every citizen of Grenada is entitled to a Grenada passport. So that does not affect your citizenship, and it certainly will not affect your passport. The law gives you the ability to do certain things with your investment that you made to attain citizenship, but having complied with the law, you will lose nothing. You do not lose your Grenada citizenship, and you do not lose your passport right ever.
Interesting. Very interesting. All right. So maybe we can explain for this client who's not quite clear still, Margaret, about the investment required and the time period for donation.
Okay. So the investment required as a single applicant, it is $150,000. As an applicant with a family of 4, it is 200,000. And every additional applicant into that application is an additional 25,000. So say you had an application of 4, and then you brought in an applicant, you brought in another child, which made it number 5. You paid 25,000 additional on the 200,000. If you brought in your sibling, which you are allowed, that sibling will pay an additional 75,000. If you brought in a parent under 55, that parent will then pay an additional 50,000. Plus that parent would be deemed an additional applicant, so you pay the 25,000.
Okay, thanks, Margaret.
So so that is the donation route.
Okay, so sorry I joined later the recording. Yes, if you can email Duncan, we can make a recording available. So if you email dhill, DHILL at US
Mark, we'll send this out to everybody who attended, so you'll all receive a copy by email. But you're welcome to contact us as well. So I'm dhill at usimmigrationadvisor.com. But yes, we will be following up with a recording.
Okay, Duncan, for some reason, I can't read the questions on the webinar chat. Is there anything on there that we need to address?
No,
I'm Q&A, but I can't read the webinar chat questions.
It's fine. They're all personal, so I'm responding to them directly.
Gotcha. Okay, hello. With the new law, can Russian nationals still apply for an E2 visa after 3 years from obtaining Grenadian citizenship? Well, the first thing is
corrected to 5.
It's corrected to 5. Okay, but that's I think the question, Margaret, here is if a Russian gets Grenadian citizenship through investment, I suspect the question is if a Russian gets Grenadian citizenship through a financial investment and they've done that for 3 years, can they apply for an E2? I think that's probably what the question is. And the answer is, well, have you been domiciled in Grenada? So you would need to reach out and we would need to determine whether we can say that you've been domiciled in Grenada or not. Now, an interesting thing with Grenada, I asked Margaret, is can you file a retroactive tax return? Because we certainly do that in the United States and we've certainly done that in the UK. So just because I didn't file a Grenadian tax return 2 years ago, does that stop me from filing one now covering the period 2 years ago? And I think your answer was no. And one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and I'll ask you, Margaret, in terms of taxes, if I start filing Grenadian tax returns, but I have no income other than in Grenada, what is my tax position? If I declare myself a Grenadian domicile and I start filing Grenadian tax returns, but I don't have any income in Grenada, do I have any Grenadian tax to pay?
No. Under the current tax regime of Grenada, taxes are only paid on income earned in Grenada.
Okay, all right. Understood. So that's, filing a Grenadian tax return doesn't seem to be that bad, right? You would declare, I guess you would declare all of your income, but most of it would be foreign income, so you wouldn't owe any tax on it, unless you happen to have a business in Grenada, which most people clearly don't. So I think that answers that question. Let's see. Done. Assuming I am a Grenada citizen applying for an E2 visa for the US, do I have to show funds coming from Grenada, or can they come from anywhere in the world? That's an easy question. They can come from anywhere in the world. US doesn't care where the money comes from. They can even come from the United States. Let's see. Is it 3 or 5 years? We've answered that one. Do you think this new American law change will affect the position of the European Union decision on RCBI programs? I would suspect it's not going to affect it. For those of you who don't know, the EU has been is being increasingly tough on EU member states with citizenship and residency by investment programs, and there's tightening up. personally don't see why that would impact it. Now, I'm a licensed lawyer in the UK, so I can speak to that, though we have lots of people doing the Italian route, and I would let the Italian lawyers answer for that one. One thing I was going to mention is, let's look at the reason sort of for this new law, which is bringing Portugal on as an E2 or an E1 country. You know, to me, a very like important point to be made is this, that a lot of people are unaware that Portugal, and we have a lawyer in Portugal, Barbara, and I'll try and get Barbara perhaps on another call about this, but Portugal is very, very generous with its citizenship. If you were born, or certain of your forefathers were born in a Portuguese colony. So here's the thing that can happen with Portugal. It's been some time that persons from Brazil have claimed Portuguese nationality. It's been some time people from Goa in India have claimed Portuguese nationality. It isn't that difficult. And then there's Macau. There's places all over the world that are former Portuguese colonies where people may have the ability to claim Portuguese passport. So Portugal becoming an E2 visa potentially opens a floodgate to, without exaggeration, thousands and thousands of E2 applications from Brazil. And Brazil has been a place where it's just been very difficult for Brazilians to get US visas. The reason for that is Brazilians have statistically, Brazil is a country where people go to America and they overstay their visas. So I'm not saying that's right or wrong, it's just statistically a fact. And so it's been difficult. We used to take Brazilians, get them an Italian citizenship, because many of them can trace Italian if you can trace Italian ancestry, you may be able to claim an Italian passport, and then with an Italian passport get an E2 visa. Well, sometimes that's rather a tricky and sort of tortuous route. If Brazilian nationals can claim Portuguese passport, as many of them can, simply because Brazil was a former Portuguese colony, you've now completely opened the E2 program potentially for people from Brazil. So I've heard that actually that's some of Congress's concern with the tightening of this, and that might not affect everybody. So I think that's just a sort of an interesting piece of background. The question of returning, let's see, how are we doing for time? I won't run too much late, Margaret, but we're getting a lot more questions in the other two webinars. The questions keep coming, which is a good thing. The question in relation to returning investment sums is based on developers offering buyback offers to investors. Oh, I think it's a statement of fact after a holding period. Okay, fine. Done. Okay. Somebody wants their question answered. So this is from the Pakistani gentleman. Please reach out to us directly. We have a company that will provide consultation to professionals willing to relocate from Pakistan. Please tell me if your company has a policy to partner with us. So again, you're asking about partnering with our firm, potentially partnering with Margaret's firm. You know, please reach out to us directly, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But a conversation about your exact personal circumstance on this one, and potentially a partnership with our firm, is probably not of interest to sort of most people on this call. But you know, please reach out to us directly, and you know, we'd be happy to have words with you. That's that one done. If you do not satisfy the government mandate holding period, so Margaret, I think this is probably a question for you. If you do not satisfy the government mandated holding period of 5 years, surely you risk losing your citizenship. Please clarify. Margaret?
How would you not hold your investment for 5 years? Currently, I know the Citizenship by Investment Unit is addressing the question of the 5-year holding period. And so very soon, you will see the guidelines as to how you can divest yourself and what would be the consequences of divesting yourself of that investment before the stated time.
Okay, so you're saying that there's a lack of clarity really on this right now. But
there's a lack of clarity on this right now.
That's very interesting. Again, I learn things from you all the time, Margaret. I didn't know this. I thought that my belief was that if you got your money back in less than 5 years, you risked losing your citizenship, but you're saying that's not quite clear.
But no developer will risk losing their benefit under the program by doing something which is in contravention of the law.
Right. So what you're saying is, as a
So you have to
practical
have two
matter,
to partner, but
as a
that will be clarified very shortly by our citizenship by investment unit. They actually spoke to it two months ago in a meeting, so it is being addressed, and I anticipate it's just a couple of weeks before we have that guideline.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Margaret. Right. So I'm just reading these questions. We will go another 10 minutes, Margaret, and if that's okay with you, and then we will wrap this, because I just think we're not going to be able to answer all the questions because there are too many. So please do follow up, and please do, forward your questions. What is the best way to reach out to you directly? Could you provide a phone number? You can email, Duncan gave his email address, which is, I'll give you mine, which is midavies, midavies @usimmigrationadvisor.com. Right now, I usually travel some of our foreign locations, but right now I'm in New York. My US cell phone number is 860-830-5665. That's 860-830-5665. That won't work if I go back to Asia, potentially, but right now it does. Margaret, you can give whatever information, contact information of yours you'd like to.
It's Margaret at Infinity Grenada, INFINITY, Grenada, GRENADA, one word, .com.
Okay, there's that. So I'm just reading these questions, Margaret. Some of them are quite long. Okay. Oh, there was a technical question here, which is for E2, it's an E2 visa question. Can you have dual nationality on an E2 visa? And the answer is yes. What do I mean by that? I mean that the example was an Ecuadorian and a Mexican. If an Ecuadorian owns 50% of an E2 company and a Mexican owns 50% of an E2 company, they can both qualify for E2 visas because they own 50% or more. However, there would have to be substantial enough investment to warrant the two E2 visas. So typically for E2, and several people ask this question, a very common question is, how much investment is required for an E2 visa? The answer is, under the law, none. There is no minimum investment. However, the US State Department has a guideline that talks about $100,000 minimum investment. So it's suggesting that consular officers look for $100,000 minimum investment, but that's not required. And we frequently see investments of less than $100,000 that qualify. So I think that, 100,000 is recommended. So in the case of two, I would always want my client to have probably 100,000 each of investment. Again, does that say that anywhere in the Immigration and Nationality Act? No, it doesn't. That's just sort of best practice. The other point about E2 investment that people forget is it doesn't have to be cash. So a very common scenario for us is we'll have a client who, I don't know, perhaps they make T-shirts or something. They open a warehouse in America, and then they can, sending a stock of T-shirts to America is an investment. So the value of the goods sent to the United States counts as investment as well. The other point is people, and unfortunately there are lawyers who give out wrong information on this, that say that your investment has to be spent in advance. That's completely false. We have used escrow accounts both for change of status and never had a problem, and in many consulates around the world and never had a problem. So the way you use an escrow account for an E2 is you come up with a business plan. And the business plan says that, this is the money I need, and this is how much it will be spent if you're setting up your own business. We then escrow the funds in a way that they're locked up. So they can only be used for the purposes as articulated in the business plan. And as I've said, so far, we've had many change of status cases where USCIS have accepted that. And I could give you a long list of consulates if I went and sat down and went through the list where that's been non-problematic too. So, you know, this whole concept of how much do you have to invest for an E2 visa, the use of an escrow account is perhaps more common in the context of purchasing a business. So if you're going to purchase your E2 business, you would put the purchase price in a escrow account. And the term of the escrow account would say, once I get my E2 approved, then there's sort of nothing I can do to stop it. The money will go out and I'll purchase the business. What that does is if for some reason you don't get an E2 visa, then you will be able to get your money back. It'll come back, can potentially come back to you out of escrow. You know, E2 visa is a very good visa. Investment doesn't have to be cash. If it's going to be cash, you can, you don't necessarily have to spend it up front through an escrow mechanism. So, you know, I find it to be a very good visa. Yes, someone's asking, do we do EB5 cases? We do a lot of EB5 cases.
Mark, if I may add, Grenada allows dual citizenship. Well, we allow multiple citizenship. I myself hold 3 passports. So the dual citizenship is available for persons who become citizens of Grenada.
Okay. And some countries, you know, don't allow dual citizenship. India, right, is a country that, you know, they've been talking for some years about India changing the law on this. But one of the vestiges of their colonial past in India is very strict rules on dual nationality. And the reason for that, I read a book by an Indian, it was very interesting. The reason was because the British, India was very much the jewel in the crown, and people from other countries in the British Empire wanted to go to India and they had to stop it. So they put very strict controls in place. At least this was according to this Indian academic who wrote the book, and said that that has spilled over to, you know, that culture has spilled over to current Indian policy, and India does not currently allow dual nationality. But, you know, people talk about that changing all the time. But for an Indian, it's very easy. You do OCI, Overseas Citizenship of India. We have many clients who do that. And in fact, what clients end up doing, we don't recommend this because we can't as a lawyer, but we can tell you what the penalty is. What Indian clients usually end up doing is they obtain a Grenadian citizenship or possibly a Turkish citizenship. They don't surrender their Indian passport. They go ahead, they get the E2 visa on their Grenadian or Turkish citizenship, and then they surrender the Indian passport. And there is a consequence to that, which is a small fine. If you apply for an OCI, if you surrender your Indian passport and apply for an OCI and you leave it too long, there is a small fine, but it's a small fine. And that's just what's, you know, happened to many of our Indian clients. So Margaret, we're coming up on time. Is there any option for Portugal? I'm not sure what it means by, is there any option for Portugal? Portugal has residency by investment. They do not have citizenship by investment. But as I mentioned, what Portugal does have is they have this very generous, they have 2 things. They have this very generous attitude towards persons of their former colonies. Big ones being obviously now Brazil and Goa. And, you know, there are possibilities in that direction. I would not want to speak. I'd much rather have Barbara, who's our Portuguese immigration lawyer in Lisbon, on to talk about that. And the other thing is, like Italy, I think Portugal also has a very generous citizenship program when it comes to citizenship by descent. So if you can show that you are of Portuguese descent, then there may be opportunities for Portugal too. Italy, I'm very familiar with because my firm has 4 offices in Italy and we do a lot of those cases. And basically you could show your Italian descent back to the Middle Ages as long as you can prove it. And Italy will then bestow citizenship on you. I think with other European nations, with most of them, there's a limit to the number of generations. Ireland does the same thing. And I think it's, off the top of my head, I think it's 2 generations, but that's, I think, the question about Portugal. So yes, there are Portuguese options, but they don't, but not through a donation, no, there's no citizenship through donation. Okay, what if I establish a company in the US? Can I invest in that company for the purpose of getting an E2 visa? Yes, you can. Now, here's the catch, and I'll mention this because it's a good point. Is you have to make a substantial investment for an E2 visa, and it's now clear that you need to make a substantial investment after obtaining the citizenship of choice. You know, probably going to be Turkey or Grenada. So you need to make a substantial investment after the citizenship of choice. Your US company can be formed before you get that, and you can own that. So I could say, you know, I'm Indian. I could set up a business in America today, and I could own it 100%, but not really capitalize it, and then wait until I get my Grenadian citizenship to capitalize that business. But be careful, because you want to leave sort of the business of investing and making your substantial investment in that business until after you get the Grenadian passport. Margaret, it's 11:30, so I'm going to offer you anything else you'd like to say about this process, or yourself, or your firm, or BB's Crab Shack, or anything you want to in the beautiful island of Grenada.
Oh, well, I think you have said most of what I wanted to say. I would say that Grenada's program, we are always, you know, through COVID, we implemented some really unique things. So we now operate on a portal where everything is filed online. So Grenada's program is making strides. We have a central bank that work along with us on all of the citizenship by investment applications, and the what I would call the new citizens. The bank is very cooperative with help in terms of opening and establishing accounts for our citizens. And so on a whole, the Grenada program has taken root in Grenada for the benefit of our incoming citizens, which we welcome. So for all the persons who are intending to have applicants to Grenada or be an applicant to Grenada, we welcome you. We welcome you to our program, and we will work to ensure that the benefits you expect you will attain. So be it E2, that is a new topic, very new topic to the government. It's just happened over Christmas weekend. We are just back to work this week. In the Caribbean, you know, we start work the second week in January, although we come to work the first week in January. We start working the second week in January. So from where we sit, we are going to address these things more. These things are going to be brought forward and addressed. And at a later stage, we can probably have an update webinar.
Okay, all right, sounds good. Thank you very much, Margaret.
Thank you. And I thank all persons who joined the webinar.
Thank you, bye-bye.